In 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was on the cover of Fortune magazine. The headline called her the next Steve Jobs. She was 31 years old, worth an estimated $9 billion on paper, and running a company that she claimed had invented a technology capable of detecting hundreds of diseases from a single drop of blood. No needles, no laboratories, no waiting days for results, just a finger prick, a proprietary device called the Edison, and a result in hours. The story was perfect. A young woman who had dropped out of Stanford at 19 to change medicine forever. A board packed with former secretaries of state, generals, and senators. A product that would democratize healthcare and save millions of lives. Silicon Valley had produced many audacious visions. This one felt different. This one felt human. None of it was true. The Edison machine did not work. The technology did not exist. The tests were being run on conventional laboratory equipment made by other companies, diluted and modified in ways that produced results so unreliable that the company's own scientists had raised alarms for years. Patients received false positive results for HIV and cancer. Patients received false negative results that delayed treatment for real diseases. The $9 billion valuation was built entirely on a lie that Holmes had sustained through force of personality, strategic secrecy, and the systematic intimidation of anyone who threatened to tell the truth. When the lie finally collapsed, Holmes was charged with criminal fraud. She was convicted. She went to prison. And the question that Silicon Valley and the wider world has been trying to answer ever since is not just how Holmes managed to deceive so many sophisticated people for so long. The deeper question is what those people wanted to believe so badly that they stopped asking the questions they should have asked from the beginning. Elizabeth Holmes did not invent herself from nothing. She was the product of a specific environment and a specific set of ambitions that Silicon Valley had been cultivating for decades. She grew up in Washington, D.C., the daughter of an Enron vice president and a congressional staffer, in a family where ambition and connections were the primary currencies. From an early age, Holmes was exceptional, intellectually driven, intensely focused, and possessed of a quality that would serve her both brilliantly and catastrophically: the ability to make people believe in her completely. She enrolled at Stanford to study chemical engineering and spent her first year absorbing everything she could about medical diagnostics. In 2003, at the age of 19, she withdrew from Stanford, returned the tuition money her parents had paid for the upcoming semester, and founded a company she initially called Real-Time Cures, later renamed Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. The founding premise was genuine in its ambition, if not in its execution. Holmes had identified a real problem in healthcare. Traditional blood testing required large samples drawn by venipuncture, processed in centralized laboratories, with results taking days to return. For patients in remote areas, for early disease detection, for routine monitoring of chronic conditions, this system had genuine inefficiencies. Holmes wanted to build a device that could run comprehensive blood panels from a single finger prick sample, small enough to fit in a pharmacy, fast enough to return results within hours. Had the technology been achievable, it would have been genuinely transformative. The problem was that it was not achievable. The fundamental chemistry and physics of blood testing create minimum sample size requirements that a finger prick cannot reliably meet for the range of tests Holmes was promising. The scientists she hired in the early years understood this. Holmes did not accept their conclusions. What happened inside Theranos over the following decade is a case study in how a founder's certainty, when it crosses into pathology, can override every institutional safeguard designed to protect the people those institutions are supposed to serve. Holmes created a culture of total secrecy, enforced through aggressive non-disclosure agreements and the constant threat of litigation. Employees who raised concerns about the technology were fired or threatened. Scientists who produced test results that contradicted Holmes's public claims were told to find different methods. The company's laboratory director, who was legally responsible for the accuracy of the tests being run, was kept deliberately isolated from the board and from investors. Theranos' own internal validation data, the studies that were supposed to prove the Edison machine worked, repeatedly showed results that were inconsistent, unreliable, and in some cases clinically dangerous. Holmes saw these results not as evidence that the technology did not work, but as engineering problems to be managed while the company continued to sell its services to the public. The board she assembled was one of the most remarkable collections of prestigious names in American public life. George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. Henry Kissinger, former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. James Mattis, former four-star Marine general who would later serve as Secretary of Defense. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Two former U.S. senators. A former CEO of Wells Fargo. The combined biography of the Theranos board read like a who's who of American institutional power. What it did not contain was a single person with relevant expertise in blood diagnostics, laboratory medicine, or medical device regulation. Holmes had assembled validators rather than overseers. The board's function was not to scrutinize the technology. Its function was to make scrutiny seem unnecessary. Who would question a company whose board included two former secretaries of state? The investors were equally distinguished and equally incurious. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The DeVos family invested $100 million. The Walton family, founders of Walmart, invested $150 million. The venture capital community was notably absent from Theranos' investor list. Holmes had deliberately avoided Silicon Valley's traditional VC firms, whose partners had the technical background to ask difficult questions. Instead, she raised money from wealthy families and institutions whose due diligence process was less technically sophisticated. The strategy was intentional. Holmes understood that the people most likely to expose the fraud were the people she needed to avoid. The partnership with Walgreens, announced in 2013, was the moment Theranos stopped being a private fraud and became a public health risk. Walgreens agreed to install Theranos wellness centers in its pharmacy locations across the United States, offering finger-prick blood tests to the general public at prices significantly below traditional laboratory rates. Within 2 years, Theranos testing centers were operating in dozens of Walgreens locations across Arizona and California. Ordinary patients, not investors, not board members, not sophisticated professionals with legal resources and financial buffers, were receiving medical test results from a machine that did not work as advertised and from tests being run on conventional equipment in ways that compromised their accuracy. A patient in Arizona received a false positive result for a rare autoimmune condition. A patient received results suggesting a cancer that was not there. Others received results suggesting diseases were absent that were present. The people bearing the cost of the fraud were not wealthy. They were people going to a Walgreens for a blood test because it was convenient and affordable, and they trusted the system that was supposed to ensure it was accurate. John Carreyrou was a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter who had spent years covering the pharmaceutical industry. In 2015, he received a tip from a source close to Theranos suggesting that the company's technology was not what it claimed to be. What followed was one of the most consequential pieces of investigative journalism in recent American history. Carreyrou spent months tracking down former Theranos employees who had left the company, many of them still bound by non-disclosure agreements and terrified of litigation. He found scientists who described a company that had been aware for years that its technology did not meet the standards it was publicly claiming. He found documentation of test failures, internal complaints, and the systematic suppression of concerns by Holmes and her partner, and company president Ramesh "Sunny" Balwani. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first story. Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. The story was carefully worded, thoroughly sourced, and entirely accurate. Holmes's response was immediate and aggressive. She went on CNBC the same day and called the story factually incorrect. She appeared on stage at the Wall Street Journal's own conference and said the story was a devastating attack from people who didn't understand the technology. She had done this before. Every internal dissenter, every scientist who had questioned the technology had faced the same response. The accusation was always that the critic didn't understand. This time, it was different. Carreyrou did not stop. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services began an investigation of the Theranos laboratory in Newark, California. What federal inspectors found when they arrived was a laboratory that was operating outside its certification, running tests on equipment it was not licensed to use, and producing results that failed basic accuracy standards. In July 2016, federal regulators banned Holmes from owning or operating a medical laboratory for 2 years and moved to revoke Theranos' laboratory certification. Walgreens terminated its partnership. The Edison machines were retired. The company that had been valued at $9 billion began liquidating its assets. Holmes was charged with criminal wire fraud and conspiracy in June 2018. Balwani was charged separately. Both faced the possibility of decades in federal prison. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes opened in August 2021 and lasted 4 months. The government's case was built on patient records, internal emails, investor presentations, and the testimony of former employees and laboratory scientists. The defense argument was that Holmes had genuinely believed in the technology, that she had been deceived by Balwani, and that her failures were the failures of an entrepreneur rather than a criminal. Holmes took the stand in her own defense, an unusual decision, and spent days describing a company whose problems she attributed to the normal difficulties of building a revolutionary technology while under immense external pressure. She cried on the stand. She described a relationship with Balwani that she characterized as abusive. The jury deliberated for 7 days. On January 3, 2022, they found Holmes guilty on 4 counts of criminal fraud and conspiracy against investors. They acquitted her on charges related to defrauding patients, a verdict that many patient advocates found difficult to accept given the evidence of harm. Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison in November 2022. She reported to a minimum security facility in Texas in May 2023. Balwani was convicted separately and sentenced to nearly 13 years. The financial wreckage of Theranos was total. Investors lost approximately $900 million. Walgreens and other partners lost hundreds of millions more in settlements and written-off investments. The patients who received inaccurate test results have pursued, and in some cases received settlements, though the full scope of clinical harm from the unreliable testing has never been comprehensively assessed. The $9 billion valuation that had made Holmes the world's youngest self-made female billionaire was exposed as a number built entirely on presentations that Holmes knew to be false. The Edison machine, which had been the physical embodiment of the company's claim, was never independently validated. It never worked as advertised. Not once. What the Theranos story reveals about Silicon Valley is something the technology industry has been reluctant to fully examine. The fake-it-till-you-make-it philosophy, the idea that a founder's vision should be projected with absolute confidence even when the underlying reality does not yet support that confidence, is a standard component of startup culture. It works in software, where a product that doesn't yet exist can be described in compelling terms and built before the description is tested. It fails catastrophically in medical devices, where the product is not a prototype waiting to be completed, but a diagnostic tool whose accuracy is directly connected to whether a patient lives or dies. Holmes took a software industry ethos and applied it to a regulated medical environment. And the regulatory framework that should have caught this, the FDA's medical device approval process, was circumvented because Theranos classified its tests as laboratory tests rather than medical devices, placing them under a different and less rigorous regulatory pathway. The system had a gap. Holmes found it and built a company inside it. The lesson of Theranos is not simply that Elizabeth Holmes was a fraudster. The lesson is that sophisticated institutions, investment firms, corporate boards, government agencies, major retail partners, can fail simultaneously when a sufficiently compelling story is presented with sufficient confidence by a sufficiently charismatic founder. The fraud worked not because everyone was fooled equally, but because each participant had a reason to keep believing. The investors were protecting a valuation. The board members were protecting their reputations. The regulators were operating within the boundaries of an inadequate framework. The journalists who praised Holmes before Carreiro broke the story were protecting a narrative that their readers wanted to believe. Everyone in the system was optimized for something other than the truth. And the people who paid the price were the ones who had no reason to be skeptical at all. The patients standing at a Walgreens counter, handing over a finger and trusting that the result they received was real. The blood was real. The tests were not. If you want to understand which companies today are operating on the same principle, projecting a vision that the underlying technology cannot yet support, in industries where the cost of getting it wrong falls on people who can't afford to absorb it. That is exactly what I track in my newsletter. The link is in the description, and if you want to see what happens when another founder decides the story matters more than the product, click the videos above.